On July 23rd, two men organised the event Protect Singapore Town Hall. At this event, they called for Section 377A of the Penal Code, which criminalises sex between men, to be retained until there are guarantees to protect the traditional definition of marriage and family. This law has been a bone of contention for Singaporeans. Some want it to stay, some want it gone. Others believe that with the repeal of this law, LGBT groups may push for other rights, such as marriage equality. This has also sparked calls for the constitutional protection of marriages. What does it mean and how can it be done? My name is Alyssa Wu and welcome to ST Explains. I have here with me Mr. Eugene Tan. He is a constitutional law expert and also the Associate Professor of Law at the Singapore Management University. So Eugene, how would you say marriage is legally defined here?
Well, for a legal definition of marriage, we have to turn to the Women's Charter. And in the Women's Charter, marriage is defined as a marital union between a man and a woman, one that is taken voluntarily. And it also, when read with the Interpretation Act, another piece of legislation, it is supposed to be monogamous, right? So to the exclusion of all others. This definition only applies to civil marriages. Muslim marriages are contracted under Sharia law. What would be a valid marriage under Sharia law would be slightly different from that in the Women's Charter.
What does it mean to constitutionally protect a marriage?
When you elevate the legal status of marriage, it would mean that it would be harder for someone to say, that the law should also recognize other forms of marriages, for example, same-sex marriage. And so when marriage is defined in the Constitution, it is a signal, that this is the legal understanding of what is a marriage, and that all laws must then conform with the constitutional definition, of what is a marriage.
And how can that be done?
Well, there are several ways, Elisa. One, you could have a provision in the Constitution that defines what is a marriage. You could also have another way of, elevating the status, but perhaps, in a less direct way. And that is by the Constitution recognizing, the definition of marriage, as defined in a piece of ordinary legislation, such as the Women's Charter. You could also elevate the status of marriage through the Constitution by having a provision in the Constitution that guarantees, certain rights, privileges, benefits, and even responsibilities that come from marriages which are legally valid in Singapore. In all these three different modes, you could also have a situation in which there could be a provision that says that, notwithstanding the definition or how the rights and privileges and benefits may accrue to Singaporeans, that these provisions, should not be seen as being discriminatory, right? Because under the Singapore Constitution, Article 12, provides for equality before the law and equal protection of the law. Now, whether the courts will find these different modes as being sufficient, to protect marriages in Singapore is something that remains to be seen.
So is there a constitutional law that protects the rights of everyone equally right now?
Yes.
Okay. So having said that, so let's say if heterosexual marriages are constitutionalized, would that automatically actually discriminate other groups of people? And then if that were to be in a constitution, but then you have another law that says equal rights for all, how is that going to play out?
I think that's an excellent question. So you're right. Article 12 of the Singapore Constitution provides for equality before the law and equal protection of the law. So it's often seen as, the provision that protects people against discrimination. But that is perhaps a bit of a misnomer, simply because laws do discriminate in any case. So for example, if you think about laws that treat men and women differently, adult and child differently. Someone with mental capacity and lacking mental capacity differently, citizen and non-citizen differently, right? So the laws, every law discriminates in that sense, putting it a bit boldly. But the question is whether the discrimination is justified, is permissible, is permitted by law. That really is the test. So this is where it becomes important for Parliament to debate these issues extensively, to explain why certain provisions relating to marriages are drafted the way that they are. The final call ultimately is still for the courts, to decide whether the distinction, the recognition and non-recognition of certain marriages, whether that discriminates or not.
So Eugene, I heard you use the word elevate a lot. Elevating the law, elevating like the concept of heterosexual marriages, right? From my understanding, already in Singapore, we do not recognize, we do not allow same-sex marriage. So why is there a need to have this in the Constitution?
It's an excellent point, Elisa. I think, the laws only recognize heterosexual monogamous marriages in Singapore. And so in that sense, one could say that no other types of marriages could be legally contracted in Singapore. But the argument for elevating the status, or to use a fairly big term, right, to constitutionalize the definition or status of marriages in Singapore, is essentially the view, that we want to put this traditional understanding of marriages, a monogamous heterosexual union, on a firmer footing. But putting the definition of marriages into the Constitution also means that all other laws, must conform, with the definition, of marriages in Singapore. And so what that means is that it would be difficult for parties, who contract some other types of marriage, right? Let's say they go to a country where they could contract a same-sex union. It would mean that Singapore will not recognize these marriages, and as a consequence, these parties will not be entitled, to certain rights, privileges, and benefits that arise from marriages which are legally contracted in Singapore.
So our minister, Mr. Shanmugam, he was reported to have said that the government is looking at how to safeguard the current legal position on marriage. What does he mean by that?
I don't think he is at all suggesting that the current conception of marriages, right, a heterosexual monogamous union, is under threat in Singapore. But I think the government he made those remarks in the context of what's going to happen if we do repeal Section 377A of the Penal Code. And because for certain segments of Singapore society, they have regarded 377A, as a sort of a high water mark, a sort of a flag marker of the values, that Singapore and Singaporeans hold dear. And so if you remove that flag marker, then the argument is that it may be necessary to replace, that flag marker. And this is where, the idea or the argument, for constitutionalizing the status of marriage then comes in. So in trying to safeguard, the status of marriage, I think, it is now recognized in ordinary law, the Women's Charter. And so the only way to safeguard it even further would probably require, for the definition of marriage, to be given recognition in one way or another in the Constitution.
Now, Eugene, you are a professor at a university. You engage with youths on a very regular basis. How do they view this whole issue?
So I would say that, among younger Singaporeans, I think they too would want for society to be less discriminatory. And if there is a concern that 377A, promotes discrimination, and some of them do take that view, hopefully its repeal, will help to remove discrimination. But I think it is important to remember that, repealing the law is not the silver bullet. It is a start, right? But removing discriminatory attitudes really is what each of us want to do, what each of us feel, is the right thing to do, and it is how we treat others as well. So I would say that, they are mindful about, how 377A could discriminate, but I think they too are also very convicted, that the traditional, or maybe traditional is not the right word, but the long-standing understanding of marriage, right, as being a monogamous union between a man and a woman, I think that still is something which many young people in Singapore still regard as being important, for society. But they also recognize, and I think much as many in my generation too, recognize that, we can have the traditional or the long-standing conception of marriages, coexisting, with alternative, sexual identities and orientations. And I think that in many ways, is a measure of how society, has progressed, but we still have some way to go, and hopefully, whatever accommodation, that comes about, through discussions with the different stakeholders, will be able, to enable Singaporeans, to go beyond what is it that divides us and to instead dwell on the commonalities that we have. And I think there's a better way to live and thrive.
Thank you very much, Eugene.
Thank you for having me.
Hopefully this video explains a bit more on this topic. If you have any other topics you like explored, do send an email to askst@sph.com.sg. And also remember to subscribe to the Straits Times YouTube channel for more content.